I'm Phil, that's Ned, and this is Clean Phil Wanted. And this is what I made this week. It's an A-frame clothing rack with Tusk Mortise and Tenon joinery on it. This is a normal mortise and tenon joint. This has the mortise through it, a through mortise, and this is just a tenon that's on the stretcher. This stretcher has another mortise in it that is through the top, down through the bottom. And that's what this wedge fits into. Gets pretty tight just with hand, but you take a soft face mallet, tap it a few times, and you can see that's about the size of the room that takes up. It's not very big. If you're new to woodworking or you're new to this kind of joint, do the horizontal one. It's a lot easier and there's less room for error. As always, I start with a sketch. Since this is a fairly simple project, I'm not going to draw out the cut list. The rails at the bottom are 17 inches long, the uprights are 54 inches long, and for now the two stretchers are a little under 70 inches long. I'll cut those down to the length that I need a little bit later. I always start off a project by cutting off the first inch of your board, and then I cut these ones down to the length that I need. I jointed both edges so they're straight and used a marking gauge to mark in 2 inches. If you're gonna rip saw, don't rip saw to your line. Give yourself a little bit of room. Joint those surfaces true.
Here's my boy. Always have a woodworking dog with you. Or a cat. There's cats coming here too.
To be able to mark knife walls on the uprights, we'll need to set a bevel. To find that angle, I paired up the uprights and found the center. I clamped those center lines together at the top, and I used the rail to line up the outside corners of the uprights and the rail to make sure that the bottom was 17 inches wide. You can then use that bottom rail and one of the uprights to set your bevel and check it on your other upright. And while the pieces are still clamped together, use a marking knife to lightly mark out the half lap at the top. After that, use a straight edge to set that knife wall deeper. Mark the depth of your half lap. Use a chisel on the knife wall and saw down to the depth line. And then saw out the waist. And I used my router plane to make sure the bottoms were flat, but if you don't have a router plane, Google poor man's router and you'll be able to do it with the chisels that you do have. Glue and clamp up that half lap, making sure to also clamp that rail back at the bottom so you know the angle is still correct. To make the rails half lap, measure up 4 inches on the outside edge of each upright. And use your bevel to mark the bottom edge of those uprights. Set a knife wall and saw down to your depth line. Chisel out a lot of the waste. Once you have both sides chiseled out like this, wedge the rail in and roll it over and use a marking knife to mark the up side. Saw down to your half lap and remove the waste. And I use my router plane again to level the bottom. Fit your rail into the dado housing and mark out the width that it needs to be. Make sure that the bottom edges are still at 17 inches. Use a bevel and your marking knife to strike those lines deeper and remove the waste from those rails. Here I'm marking out the mortises on those bottom rails.
I lined these two up, found the center, and marked out with knife walls both mortise holes. They are 5/8 of an inch wide, size of my chisel, and that is just a little bit less than the thickness of my material. 3/8 of an inch down, 3/8 of an inch up.
To mark out the mortises at the top, I sawed a flat surface onto both A-frames, making sure that they are still the same exact length. And those mortises started 1 3/8 inch down from the top. Clamp your board down to your bench top and start chiseling out your mortise. Only go halfway. Flip the board over and come in from the other side so you don't blow out the opposite face. I've heard stories that New Zealand pine is actually really hard. Those two bottom rails were the toughest pine I've ever had to try to get through. Found out where my wife wanted this to be, and I cut the stretchers to that length. I marked the shoulders on the tenons 2 3/4 of an inch in from all ends. And I used marking gauges to mark the waist, and I used a marking gauge to mark the mortise. For this joint to work, the mortise for the wedge needs to be closer to the shoulder line than the thickness of the upright. I squarely made that mortise 1 1/4 inch wide. Only go down halfway, flip it over, come from the other side. Then I came back and chiseled the shape for the wedge. Then I used a saw, a chisel, and my router plane to remove the waist from the tenon. And I used a file to round over my tenon. And now to make the wedges. I resawed a 1/4 inch piece of material and planed it flat. I cut it into 4.5 inch pieces. What I would do to fit these normally, line this up, find the center mark, bring a pencil and mark the dot. Mark a dot where you see it come out here and up here. Draw a line between them. These are, by chance, the same angle that I was using up here. I'm just going to find the center point and draw a line through it. I used a hand plane to round over that top stretcher, and I went over the entire piece with a plane to remove all the sharp edges, and I filed the top round. With all the joints finally fit, I now glued the rails into the uprights and planed all the joints flush. Now use that bevel one last time to mark your feet and saw them off. Round those babies over. This one has a couple coats of a polyurethane on it just to help take some of the damage that it would get. After watching this and seeing how little damage it took at all, this one all I did was put on a flash coat of shellac, spit coat as the furniture guys would say, and just went over it with a super fine steel wool to smooth it out. There's not even furniture wax on this. I didn't want any furniture wax getting on her clothes for whatever reason, so I just let that part go. Really happy with it. It turned out really well. For all the little mistakes that I have in there, it still looks pretty good. Also, I'm going to be trying to put up projects like this every week, simple things that you can do at home. So please subscribe. Join in my journey. Let me know your ideas. Let me know what you'd like me to try to do. Hey, thanks for watching. This is good. I know the wife's gonna like this. She may like this better than her birthday gift last week. We'll find out.